I don't know anymore today, but there was a poll done roughly 20 years ago, 15 years ago. If the United States and North Korea go to war, for whom will you fight? And as many people said, I'll fight for Korea, as said, I'll fight for the US. I'll fight for North Korea, as would fight for the US. So there, I mean, commonly popular support for Korea against Japan, against the US, against China, against Russia, against everybody. Korea as the what people's interest in freedom for is about. So it's a misconception, I think, that Koreans are not unified.
Right.
Like I say, even in South Korea, the majority of the movement are, so for the NL people, just to be clear, the main contradiction is US imperialism. For PD, the popular democracy, people's democracy, the main contradiction is with corporate control.
Right.
And, the different emphases. And so, but the point I want to make is that the NL stream, the strongest of the two in the unions, in, all the aspects of the movement's life, basically support North Korea.
We group us up like ants in a colony. Organize the wealth into a socialist economy. A way of life based off the common needs. And all my comrades is ready, we can spread the seed. And all my comrades is ready, we can spread the seed. And all my comrades is ready, we can spread the seed.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to a very special evening edition of Subversive History. Our guest is in a different time zone, so we're recording at night this time. My name is Pat, and I'm joined by my co-host, Johnny. Today, we are joined by George Katsiaficas. George Katsiaficas has contributed significantly to the study of political science and sociology by coining his Eros effect theory. He was a research affiliate at Harvard in both European and Korean studies, and also spent many years teaching at Chonnam National University in South Korea. In addition to academia, George Katsiaficas also acted as an activist in many capacities, including organizing anti-war protests, establishing food co-ops and nonprofit bookstores, and also faced legal persecution for his support of the Black Panther Party. He has authored numerous books, including The Imagination of the New Left, The Subversion of Politics, and his series Asia's Unknown Uprising, which will be the focus of today's discussion. George, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Johnny, do you have any introduction that you'd like to give?
This book, like for most people probably have never even heard of the Gwangju Uprising, but this book, the humanity oozes out of it. Like you mentioned Marcuse, you mentioned Hegel, you mentioned all of like these like literary like sources while going over this event that like for the larger Western world, it's been almost completely forgotten, right? There are comparisons to be made, but we'll get to that question.
Okay.
It's interesting that we all lately, at least the Korean cultural scene has made it big in the West, with K-pop, Korean dramas, Korean television shows, all of it. But where does that come from? I saw it by studying the Gwangju Uprising, and there's a section in my book that says the coming Korean wave. It was obvious, the pent up creativity, freedom yearning, the soulfulness of Korean people. It was clear. It was, and the Gwangju Uprising is at the core of that.
Before we get into the specifics of Korea, much of your writing focuses on something you refer to as the Eros effect. Considering this phenomenon is so central to your work, could you briefly describe to our audience what is the Eros effect?
Sure. I take it from my teacher, Herbert Marcuse, who worked with Freud's late theory of the instincts. That is, the life instincts, or eros, and the death instincts, or thanatos. So let's say, much like Christians believe God and the devil are at war trying to control human behavior, I think the Freudian Marcusean theory is that there's life instincts and death instincts, and they're in constant rivalry with each other to control our emotions. And frankly, sometimes Eros loses and Thanatos wins, as in, let's say, just to use an easy example for us, Nazi Germany. We could talk about more recent genocides, but let's just keep it easy and say Nazi Germany. We would all, I think, agree on that. Then the Eros effect are the opposite in the sense that these are moments when oppressed people, when people who are exploited, people who are repressed, people who are powerless, suddenly awaken. And instead of hierarchy in society, there's equality. Instead of competition, there's cooperation. Instead of people making wars, there's tremendous reaction against wars and yearning for peace. So I've seen this and felt this in my own ways, and I developed the theory based on my understanding, my study of 1968. How, for instance, how do we understand that? I was sitting at my table overlooking the Pacific Ocean in 1981 and 2. And suddenly I had a eureka moment because I had all these notes I had been in Berlin, I had been doing research in many parts of the world. And I realized all of a sudden, these protests, massive protests, were all related to each other. They all happened within days and weeks of each other. And how did we understand that? And Marcuse's ideas were very present in my mind. And I started thinking political eros, and I wasn't comfortable in discussion with a friend, Rick Nato, and we came up with Eros effect as this phenomenon.
Wow. Thank you so much for describing that so eloquently. Before we get into the specifics of the book itself, I was hoping you could give our audience some insight into your personal relationship with Korea. And furthermore, as someone who is not ethnically Korean, what motivated you to study the nation so intimately?
It's interesting that you point out I'm not ethnically Korean. I suppose, in blood, but I mean, Americans aren't really a country that at least has in the past defined ourselves by blood in terms of citizenship. And I mean, I do have a Korean name given to me by my Korean brother, and my name is Yoon Kwang-hyun. And I'm occasionally called Kwang-hyun by very close friends in Korea. Very early on, when I moved to Korea, I had a dream, and I was looking in the mirror, and I noticed that I looked Korean. I had Korean facial features, and I said to the mirror, "Oh, I'm looking Korean. Have I always been Korean?" And the mirror said back to me, "Yes, welcome home." And it put me so at ease in the context of Korea that I was able to spend years and years there. I also fell madly and deeply in love with a woman and married her, and a fellow activist who's sadly passed 11 years ago. And but I had a wonderful circle of friends in Gwangju because I went to Korea for the first time knowing next to nothing about Korea. And my book on 68 had been translated and had become something of a bestseller. I mean, not like anything, I don't know, that I've experienced for radical books in the United States. I mean, it was being reviewed in conservative newspapers, very conservative, Chosun Ilbo, which is a newspaper that moderates boycott to this day in Korea. And I was able to say a few things that got through their extreme censorship that made sense to people. So, I mean, it propelled me into a kind of status that I was able to speak my mind openly. I don't know if you guys have this problem, but in the United States, I'm very guarded in what I say publicly, or I try to be. Mm-hmm. And so just to give you one example, my concept of the Eros effect, people would take me to dinner and say, look, how in the world did you understand the Gwangju uprising so well? And I would say, look, this concept of the Eros effect, and we would talk about it, and they would go, but that's the Gwangju uprising. How did you come up with that? And I would say, I did, we would have this discussion, and it was just that Korean history and my understanding of the world just fit together so well. I mean, and not only intellectually, but emotionally. Like I say, I fell in love, but I had a great circle of friends in particularly in Gwangju. And, I really enjoy Korea. In the United States, mother-in-laws and son-in-laws are famously alienated from each other. Korea is the opposite. The son-in-law and the mother-in-law get along super well. And I mean, I got along super well with my wife, but she didn't like duck. And guess what? My mother-in-law and I love duck. So we had a standing date. We still do when I go to Korea. We go out for duck. And I mean, and also, she's a salt of the earth person. So I tell her, bring your stainless steel with the cover and we'll order two and you can bring one home. And of course, most Koreans don't do that. I mean, in South Korea, the amount of food that goes to waste is atrocious. You go to a big feast and then you get up to leave and there's still tables full of food, which, it's hard to accept, but it's just life. But she's happy to take the food with her. And I'm happy that, so we get along on all these levels. I got along in Korea. I mean, it's also the case that as in any scene, any country that has very dynamic social situations, I've also had conflicts in Korea. I mean, and heartfelt pain and political disagreements and physical confrontation in one case. And I mean, but it just, everything seemed to work out. Like after it's a long story, but after I had this physical confrontation with somebody, his friends and my friends arranged a meeting, and we suddenly turned a corner and became friends. And we had not known each other before that, but I realized, this culture, there's some depth to it that we just don't have. And we can, talk about this more at some point, but I felt like I could do nothing wrong in Korea.
So the first volume of your series, Asia's Unknown Uprising, has been tremendously influential for me personally, as it was one of the first books I read when I became interested in history. I just, like, my copy here, you can see it's like weathered at this point. Like I've gone through it a handful of times, and a lot of highlights and everything like that. So I really, really enjoy this book. But the main reason I was so enamored with your book was that it contradicted so many of the things that I was led to believe about Korean history. In your preface, you state, "I have never seen such a wide variation between what I consider the truth and propaganda as I have in relation to Korea." In your opinion, what are the common misconceptions Americans have regarding Korean history?
Good question. First of all, I think Americans, because of recent history, Americans think of Koreans as divided. And indeed, since the U.S. divided the country, in 1948, with the elections that people in South Korea opposed, but which were, at the point of bayonets and bullets forced on them, Korea from 918 to 1910, that's almost 1,000 years, were united. There were only 2 dynasties in that period. In China, in that same period, there were like 10 dynasties, and the country wasn't united. Korea was united for 1,000 years. And people still have a consciousness of what's happening all over the country. I mean, if you sit in a government office in South Korea, the map on the wall is of all Korea. And if you sit in North Korea in a government office, the map is all of Korea. So they both believe that Korea is still unified. You don't go in there and see, South Korea and North Korea as separate entities on the wall. So, it's not just, it's certainly the language. And I mean, Korea it's the only alphabet independently formed in Asia. I mean, unless you call it Chinese characters an alphabet, which I'm not sure about, but Sejong, the great King Sejong in 1446 had assembled a group of scholars to create a Korean alphabet that they say is based on the shape of the mouth and the way in which sounds are made by people. And so, that's very unique to Korea. And, I think there's a real history of oppression, of oppressive, feudal relations that is a distant memory today for many people, but still there is an innate sympathy for the oppressed I have found, certainly in South Korea, and I think in North Korea as well. So there's now you asked me what are the impressions that Americans have. So first of all,
the misconceptions that they have.
The division, and maybe, I don't know, honestly, I don't know America well enough sometimes. Because, I mean, it's a good, I don't know.
I have a handful this is kind of going to be kind of like a guiding theme of the discussion, is certain things about misconceptions. But something that I feel like is important for someone that isn't aware of the history of Korea, a tragic yet unavoidable factor in understanding Korea's historical development is the period of Japanese colonization.
Oh, yeah.
Can you briefly describe the ways in which Japan treated its colonial subjects in Korea, and furthermore, how the Koreans valiantly resisted this occupation?
Wow. Yeah. And that's still like a major sore point in the understanding of Koreans, North and South. So there's another way in which they're unified. Because, I mean, they're Russia, China, Japan, major powers, major populations. Korea was, kicked around for centuries by these folks. So, and the Japanese were, I mean, let's say it, they were culturally inferior for millennia. It was, I said a moment ago that Korea was unified from 918 to 1910. Before that, there was a unified dynasty for 250 years called the Shilla dynasty. And it was brought to an end. And there was a 3-kingdom period that lasted about 250 years. And in that 3-kingdom period, the Paekje, which is, by the way, in the southern part of the peninsula where Gwangju is, the Paekje nobles were defeated, and they set sail in a ship off the west coast of Korea around the peninsula to the east coast of Japan, and brought with them, the knowledge of making pottery, the fine arts, landscape painting, but they also formed the royal family of what became Japan. And this, of course, if you say this, I challenge you, say this to a Japanese or a Japanese American, and they're going to accuse you. But in my humble opinion, and I've seen some of the artifacts, and as I have come to understand, even the Japanese royal family will admit that their origins, these sort of semi-secret items they have in their collection of familial heirlooms, are Korean. And so there was this tension from the start. Who are these, this idea of others? Japan for centuries tried to conquer Korea and failed. I mean, Hideyoshi's invasion, 1392, 100 years before Columbus. You've probably seen the movie, it's renamed, about Admiral Sun Shin, whose fleet meager fleet defeated an enormous Japanese fleet.
Were these the Iron Turtle ships?
Yes,
Okay.
the turtle ships.
I haven't seen the movie,
Yeah.
but I've read some books. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, it's a good movie, actually. The Admiral, I think it's called, or The Swirling Seas. I think it's somehow renamed, re-released. But I mean, Hideyoshi devastated South Korea, devastated it, and parts of Northern Korea. I mean, it was, but the country survived the Hideyoshi invasions. But then what would it be? That would be 500 years later. Japan finally succeeds in conquering Korea. And I mean, they went.
With the help of the Americans, right?
Not yet.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I apologize.
The Americans legitimated it through the treaty. They basically said, Taft-Katsura Treaty, they basically said to Japan, you can have control of Korea. We're going to take control of the Philippines.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So, what is it? Quid pro quo. Anyway, but certainly the Americans after and leading up to the Second World War played a role in letting Japan have their way in Korea. And I think it's fair to say after the World War II, the U.S. Empowered Japanese corporations, even chemical corporations that were formed by Class A war criminals who had conducted biological warfare on captured American, Australian, British prisoners of war during the war and developed strains of diseases. The U.S. brought them all to the United States. Douglas MacArthur thought they were a great resource and used some of those same. Yeah, huh?
I believe it's Unit 731. My bad. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. But I mean, if you were Korean, you weren't allowed to use your name. You had to take a Japanese name in public. You weren't allowed to speak Korean in public. You had to speak Japanese. And these are just the sort of outward ways in which Japan dominated. I mean, thousands of women were kidnapped during the war and forced to become sex slaves to the Japanese military. Million or more, some people say 3 million Korean men were sent into the army, into the Japanese army. I mean, believe it or not, I saw an exhibition one day of Koreans trained as kamikaze pilots by the Japanese Air Force.
Oh, wow.
And, it was a random gallery I walked into, and I was kind of like, wow, had no idea. So, I mean, the Koreans were the miners. They did the dirty work of Japanese industry. The administration, the colonial administration in Korea from 1910 to 1945, 90% of the officials were Japanese. I think there was like 50,000 administrators, officials, and 400 were Korean. So, I mean, this was an occupation regime. The police were similarly, it was mainly Japanese. There were very few Koreans who, I think I might even have that written down, the number. Let me see. Anyway, 2/3 of all police were Japanese in that period of time. And, there's some pretty good movies lately about the anarchist movements in Korea in this time. And you find, of course, that there's a lot of collaborators. There are people who are helping the police. But I think it's fair to say that it was a foreign occupation regime, a settler colony, because the Japanese, for instance, in southern Chola province, South Chola, which is where Gwangju is, let me see. And again, I want to be specific here. More than half of all the rice in all of Korea was sent to Japan. But in southern Chola, 85% of all people were landless tenant farmers. And Koreans were eating, on the average, 56% of the amount of rice that they were eating in 1912.
Mm.
So it means that basically the Japanese were emptying the country's resources. You might not know this, but in the winter of 1944 to 1945, more than 1 million North Vietnamese starved to death. Out of a population of 14 million, Vietnam had been divided into three by the French. At the same moment, Japan was exporting rice from North Korea to burn in their factories because they didn't have oil, and they were burning the rice from North Korea, northern Vietnam, southern, all of it. They were just importing rice to burn in their factories. So, yeah, it was a terrible, I think, fair to say. I mean, some American writers can claim that Japan modernized Korea, that Japanese, for instance, one of the first things, I mean, Harvard-educated Japanese, like noblemen, raped and murdered the last Korean queen, Queen Min. And he was part of it, was a gang rape. And he was also, like I say, a Harvard graduate, but what's his name? Ito Hirobumi. And again, I want to get this straight because I don't want to misspeak. It's so much information. Ito Hirobumi and Harvard-educated Shiba Siru killed and gang raped Queen Min, October 8th, 1895. 14 years later, Ito Hirobumi was assassinated by An Jung-kun, who threw a bomb on a stage where he was speaking. So, you know, the guy on the top hat of Missouri, the USS Missouri, when Japan surrendered to the United States, you've probably seen the newsreel footage. He was also injured in that same bomb attack. Now, this was a partisan of the provisional government, Korean provisional government, which was based inland in China. And the Japanese conquered much of China as well, so that people continually moved westward. And this struggle that existed was massive. I mean, Korea, if the Korean Peninsula doesn't have the jungles like, say, Vietnam has jungles. So many people were compelled to leave. They went to Manchuria and they formed their own independence armies there, anarchist and Stalinist. And sadly, the anarchists were all either killed by the Japanese or by the communists. They were wiped out. But there were free communities there, of thousands of people, that self-governed communities. Very little is known about them because the history was so repressed, and the tragedy that befell them was so severe.
That argument that you said that some people try to make about Japan modernizing Korea.
Yeah, yeah,
I've literally heard, like, I'm half Daisy. I've literally heard other, like, Daisy people try to make the argument that, like, England helped modernize India, or like the Indian subcontinent, by giving it railroads and whatnot. But, like,
yeah,
the amount of
right.
people that were starved and had their land and
Yeah.
everything, culture taken from them, right, for generations, is rarely, brought up in that whole modernizing that, like, they try to.
I mean, one of the things the Japanese did very early on, Korean men, the fashion was, or the custom, even better than fashion, the custom was to have really long hair and to have a top knot to tie it in the knot. And men walking down the street would just be taken away and have those cut right off by the Japanese. And it was a great indignation, but also a way of asserting your control of another person's body, right? Their identity, and basically saying, you're powerless. We're going to rule you, and you can't use your name. You can't use your language. You have to go to Japan and fight in the military or whatever. So, but the resistance was it was like really ongoing. It never quit. And
So, you've now like laid out like a laundry list of crimes and atrocities and abuses that the Japanese imposed upon Korea while it was their colony. Um, So that leads me to kind of like another misconception that I think a lot of American people have about Korean history, and that's that after World War II ended and Japan was defeated, that the United States entered in Korea with the best interest of the Korean people in mind. Can you describe the ways in which the U.S. betrayed the Korean people upon their arrival?
Sure. I mean, you have to, if we go back to Japan's occupation of Korea, so during World War II, if people saw a US plane in the sky, they would say, that's our plane. If they saw a Japanese plane, that's an enemy plane. So there was this whole already identification with the Americans as the friends. And from the very first moment that Americans came to Korea, they were so alien from the people that they killed one of the people who was welcoming them, who was there to say, wow, we're great, welcome. And he was exuberant. Koreans are very emotional. And the guy was exuberant. He was killed by an American. And of course, not punished, not understood. But sadly, the Korean people believed that the US would help them. So even the founder of the South Korean Communist Party, Park Ho-young, pleaded with General John Reed Hodge, if you get the name John Reed Hodge, to help the South Korean. I mean, the Korean people, as soon as the atomic bomb was dropped, both Korea and Vietnam declared independence. In Korea, there were thousands of local people's committees that formed in all but 3 counties of Korea, South Korea. People's committees formed to run the counties as new governments. 1,000 new labor unions formed from these people committees. Schools, communities, everything was run by local people. And a Korean government was formed. It was called here
Korean
it is.
People's Republic.
Yes, thank you. The Korean People's Republic.
This is perfect because this was my next question. So you're swimming through it beautifully.
Okay. And I mean, this government cooperated with the United States, cooperated with the Russians. They wanted peace. They wanted equality for women. They wanted, freedom of religion, freedom of association, freedom of speech, all the things that are common sense in Tom Paine's words, they wanted and they advocated for. So it was a terrible tragedy that the United States did not support this. But it's not a mistake. I think it's people who say the U.S. made a mistake. I mean, did the U.S. make a mistake when they wiped out Native Americans? That was a mistake. Can we say it that way?
It was intentional.
Yeah, it was intentional. I mean, we put bounties on their heads. Even the buffalo, we put bounties on the buffaloes. So it was a tragedy. Did Hitler make a mistake? Is that what we say? The Holocaust was a mistake? No, we don't say that.
Right.
This was deliberate policy. The U.S. knew from the start that, have you heard this thing about stopping Russia? It's like, oh, wait, that's still going on. And then, well, Trump sort of threw out a monkey wrench into that. But for a century or more, that's been part of U.S. policy. Why did the United States support Japanese taking over Korea? To stop Russian expansionism. They believe, even though the Russians were a weak military power, they were defeated by the Japanese on a naval battle there, Port Arthur. And but still, the United States was interested in stopping the possibility of Russia influence. So, the Allies, and we forget this, the Allies were the Soviet Union, the Americans, the British, and the Chinese, the nationalist Chinese. But within days, at the end of the war, Germany and Japan went from our worst enemies to our best friends, the our being the United States. And so immediately we set out to stop Russian and later Chinese expansionism after the 1949 revolution in China. So there was no way that the United States was going to support a popular grassroots democracy in South Korea. Even as late as 1980, under our wonderful President Carter, who everybody extols for human rights and all of this, he said, well, we want democracy everywhere, but South Korea is not ready for it. And this is 1980 when they're suppressing the Gwangju uprising under Carter. He says, no, they're not ready for it. It's just atrocious how the US has continually said, oh, Koreans are like lemmings. They'll follow any strong leader, which is what the US ambassador said. Or MacArthur said, Japanese will be dominated and they'll follow whoever is the strongest leader. So the US behavior from the start was to suppress the indigenous people from having their own self-government. Now, I said a moment ago that the United States divided Korea. In fact, in 1948, they decided to have elections only in the southern part of Korea. And in response, an uprising was launched on the island of Jeju. Jeju is still, to this day, honeymoon island. It has palm trees. It has nice beaches. The people there speak a certain dialect of Korean, and they have a slogan like, no beggars, no fences, no locked doors. It's a very peaceful place. The main source of income for centuries were the women divers, free dive divers, who would bring home unbelievable abalone, fish. There's still some henya, as they're called, in Jeju and in other places. But the uprising that occurred, if there were 100 guns involved, I would be surprised. They were mainly bamboo spears, people going to police stations, trying to get their friends out of the police station, out of the jail. And, within a few hours, some of the leaders were captured and greatly repressed. But the U.S. threw everything they could find at this uprising. They had U.S. naval ships patrolling around the island. They sent in. So at this time now, Korea was being, let's say, carved up. The Soviet Union got control of Northern Korea. The U.S. got control of Southern Korea. The British got control of Southern Vietnam. The Chinese got control of Northern Vietnam. That's how the Allies dealt with this problem. The Japanese still have these two countries. What are we going to do with them? And they said, okay, well, temporary division. Of course, the Chinese and the Russians pulled out of their places without a war. The British got all the French released from Japanese prisons and then empowered the French to take back over. And the Vietnamese had to fight another war in which they lost 1 million people to get rid of French colonialism. And the Koreans, not to roll over and just accept domination by another foreign country, rose up immediately against the U.S. Jeju became a symbol. So in October of 1948, now let's say 6 months of fighting has been going on, not fighting like you think, but low-level guerrilla warfare, where partisan groups in caves on the major volcanic island of Jeju are hiding out, are just deemed to be too much, and the United States gathers the constabulary they have established in southern Korea. The 14th Regiment are gathered in Yosu and are told, here's a new gun. Tomorrow you're going to get on a ship, an American ship, and you're going to go to Jeju and put down the insurgency. Well, the men decide, a couple of thousand men decide they're not going to go, and they have an uprising and take over the city of Yosu, the nearby Suncheon, and the U.S. rushes in almost all of its officers and all of its constabularies, and they massacre. They take back the cities that the insurgents have liberated, and they just massacre left and right. Interestingly, this is not a happy anecdote. So the South Korean, at this time, this country's not divided really. I mean, the U.S. considers it divided, but the South Korean communists had separate organizational structures for officers in the constabulary and enlisted men in the constabulary. And so when the enlisted men in Yosu rose up, they killed their officers. And sadly, some of those officers were members of the Communist Officers Organization, of which these enlisted men were in the Enlisted Men Communist Organization. Because just to give you, this is just how poorly organized they were. And there was a lot of repression. The South Korean Labor Party had not, that's who I'm referring to as the communists, had not really solidified yet. It was still, Park Hun-young was still hoping the Americans would help him and help their cause. So, I mean, it was a mess. It was genuinely a mess. On the other hand, the liberated cities remained a symbol for a long time to come. Although even their history has yet to come fully to light. In this, I learned about the officers and the enlisted men through interviews. It's not from books, not from written histories. And as I say, Americans who had the privilege of writing about Korea because they had access to information that was not available in South Korea, certainly, or I suspect in North Korea, basically said these people were fools. They didn't have any chance in hell of winning. But they did. That's the thing. The United States killed more than 100,000 insurgents in southern Korea before the official start of the Korean War. I was privileged to know and become good friends with one of the so-called partisans, and Chung Do-sok, who was also a healer and all around, to me, just a really great guy. And he loved my wife. He thought she was the best revolutionary because she made a very radical film about Harvard. And South Koreans were all adoring Harvard with their emphasis on education, their emphasis on developing human capital, blah, blah, blah. And she made this film that just blew everybody out of the water as to Harvard's history of eugenics, its history, just going through all of the class actions, the support of the strike breakers. And anyway, Sacco Vanzetti,
Another famous Italian.
right. Good.
Also, your book references, like around this time period, an opinion poll that was conducted by the United States military government in South Korea, or maybe all of Korea, which asked Korean citizens what type of economics/political system they would prefer. And the results reflected 70% of Koreans choosing socialism as their preferred system. Based on this survey, would you say it's accurate that the majority of Koreans desired some form of socialism in the post-war period?
I think it is. It also needs to be asked, what did they mean by socialism?
That's why I said some form, because communism was also on there in a much smaller. There was also communism listed, which only got like 8% or something, right?
Right. When you wrote that question and when you asked it just now, I'm thinking about Vietnam. It's a very similar situation. Archimedes Pattee, who was the OSS, Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner to the CIA station chief in Vietnam, was on his way to see Ho Chi Minh. who he had met. And actually, he helped Ho Chi Minh write the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence. Ho
Yeah.
juxtaposed, Joe said, Ho Chi Minh said, liberty, life, and the pursuit of happiness. And Patty corrected him and said, no, it's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And Ho had his secretary write it down, and so he could say it right. So Patty was on his way to see Ho Chi Minh. He took a taxi, and the taxi driver said, where are you going? He says, I'm going to see Ho Chi Minh at this hotel. And the driver said, oh, Ho Chi Minh, he was legendary, right? Mythical. He lived in a cave, and now he's in town. The Viet Minh said to people in 1945, take the rice. Because the Japanese, as I said, people had starved in Hanoi, and people rose up. This is an example, I think, of liberation. And they rose up, took the rice, and people, were ecstatic about Ho Chi Minh. And so Patty says to the driver, Ho Chi Minh was a communist. And he goes, yeah, Ho Chi Minh, communist, yeah. So they get there, and he pays, and the guy says, excuse me, what's a communist? So,
Yeah.
it wasn't important. These were the leaders of the country. I mean,
well, a lot of times it would be like, oh, the Communist Party is fighting the Japanese. What's a communist? I don't know, but they're fighting the Japanese. So I'm with them. That's the people that I'm joining.
Exactly. Or I think also the idea in Asia is that there's real cooperation, there's real civil society. Americans think of saving face as an Asian character, but that implies that the society and the views of people are important, right? That we don't have that. I mean, I think in the United States, it's why do you care what other people think? It's like our attitude. And yet in Asian societies, I think the bonds are stronger. I mean, Asia is a huge place from Palestine to Korea, but what I mean, I should be more specific and say particularly Confucian, Buddhist cultures, the idea of empathy for others and of your standing with others are extremely important.
So, obviously there's two figures in this period that I think it might be important to introduce now. That would be Kim Il-sung and Syngman Rhee. Both of these men would be considered political leaders in an independent Korea. However, they contrasted in both popularity and in background. Could you introduce and compare these figures for our audience?
Sure. Kim Il-sung first got, I think, on everybody's radar in 1929 when he was a high school student, and he was arrested as part of the anti-Japanese uprising. In 1919, there had been the March 1st independence movement. Thousands of Koreans were killed. It was a nonviolent movement. The leadership all marched to the police station and turned themselves in. But the resistance that it sparked continued, without end. And Il-sung was one of those young high school students who rose up in this period against the Japanese. And he goes into Manchuria and fights during World War II. I don't know, some of the legends surrounding him are pretty amazing, but it's fair to say he was a wanted man. The Japanese formed a special unit and sent it after him. In fact, one of the people on that unit was the later dictator of South Korea, Park Chung-hee, who was dictator for 18 years. So Il-sung, the first thing he does after liberation is say, if you're farming the land, that's your land. Just keep it in North Korea. He had a very, very, very interesting concept called juche, Juche, basically translated as self-reliance. But I mean, by the time this concept, after the Gwangju uprising, becomes the basis for the radical movement in South Korea, there are three major interpretations of what juche means. And it's not it sounds easy, but it's not easy. I mean, but he basically was saying Korea should build itself up. It shouldn't rely on the Chinese. It shouldn't rely on the Japanese. It shouldn't rely on the Russians. It's like he wanted to dispossess the Japanese. He didn't believe they had helped to modernize the country. He basically killed or sent them out. So Rhee, on the other hand, was flown into South Korea, lived from New Jersey.
Hey.
And he and his Austrian wife were flown in from a life of luxury on Douglas MacArthur's private airplane. So he flew them in, and Rhee lived in a mansion. And one of the first things he did, although it's never been proven in court, but was assassinate his political rivals, especially Kim Koo, who was one of the, probably would have been his main rival, and was from the provisional government of Korea that had existed in China for decades.
Right.
So tragedy that he was assassinated. But Sigmund Rhee built prisons. He was a Christian, so he was really in the minority at that time. Christianity has made much bigger inroads in Southern Korea since then, but he lorded it over the people, it's fair to say. He ruled as some kind of a dictator, even though the U.S. would not portray him that way. He was always talked about President Sigmund Rhee.
Who was definitely elected.
Yeah, I mean, and voter fraud was rampant. So it was Rhee's undoing in 1960, when there were clearly fraudulent results posted on the elections. Young people rose up, and even before the election, young people had been disappearing and turning up with mangled bodies found by fishermen. And in the southern, let's say the southeastern part of South Korea, Masan, Pusan area, the rumblings against Rhee started, and they soon became a roar. I mean, in Seoul, the students all went on strike. The Rhee government basically ordered its thugs and police to kill people. They killed, how many students did they kill? 186 young people were killed in the uprising, April 19th, 1960. And within a week, poor Rhee was on his way to Hawaii, again, an American airplane. So poor guy. But for, a little more than a year, South Korea had a democracy run off. You know how Bangladesh today, I don't know if you followed it at all, but like hundreds of people were killed in the uprising. And now there's essentially a government that's like not a government, but it's got a lot of students who are radicals working in it. That's what South Korea had for 13 months. And they began meeting with students from Northern Korea and saying, we really want to reunify the country. And that was too much for the United States. So coup d'etat by Park Chung-hee. Now, a friend of mine, Carlos Munoz, who's also a Chicano author and activist, was in the blowouts in LA in the 60s. And still, he was a professor at UC. Anyway, he's a friend, and we were talking about this. He was in the U.S. military in Korea, and he knew about that coup d'etat before it happened. He was in the intelligence service. He said to me one day, he said, "George, I knew about that coup before it happened." I went, "What?" And so, he wrote us testimony, and we used it because at a certain point, I launched a suit whether or not the United States had assassinated Park Chung-hee in 1979, which seems highly likely that it did. And the suit was thrown out of court, of course. But Carlos we talked about how the U.S. had put him in the first place. And the same, by the way, the parallel with Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem was taken from New Jersey into Vietnam to be president. Right. I think they were both Jersey.
We're just a locus for all of the best people in history.
Right.
Like Vienna. Like
Yeah.
So, this parallel is striking where sort of people whose decision to leave the country was not based on patriotism, but was based on self-interest, are brought in to be the puppets, the Republic of Vietnam, the Republic of Korea. They have the same name, the governments that the US created all over the world, the Republic of China in Taiwan. This was something prestigious political scientists at Harvard and MIT called nation building. We're building nations. Democracy, Samuel Huntington would say the military is the motor of development. I mean, it's like, oh my God. I mean, the things we did in bringing Chiang Kai-shek to create the Republic of China and Taiwan, over 100,000 people were massacred in the first year because there was such strong opposition to it. And that history is only now coming out. They're only now digging up bodies from the Chiang Kai-shek era in Taipei and Taiwan. So, I mean, it's a tragic history, no less tragic, I think, than the history of the trail of broken treaties. It's like it's a continuity there. The frontier in the U.S. closed, and westward expansion, manifest destiny. The Philippines. It's again, they don't know. We don't know how many Filipinos were killed after the so-called Spanish-American War when the U.S. won domination. I mean, Mark Twain didn't know, and he helped form the Anti-Imperialist League in the United States. And it's like, so we don't even know, but these massacres really brought governments friendly to American economic interests into power. That was the game. And just like Native Americans, we wanted the land, we wanted their resources. We didn't need them. That was so. Again, I'm using that euphemistically.
Right. So a significant portion of your book is dedicated to the Gwangju uprising, and we've already referenced it multiple times throughout this discussion. I think it might be helpful for anybody listening that hasn't read the book or studied that. Can you describe this event and its significance for Korea's future? And furthermore, how is this a authentic representation of the Eros effect?
Yeah. I think right or left wing, anyone talking about Korean history finds Gwangju to be a central point. And the right wing today is propagating the myth that it was North Korean uprising against South Korea. Yeah, I mean, which has led to all kinds of responses. But basically, so the U.S. and Park Chung-hee, the U.S.-backed dictator, develops the corridor running from Seoul southeast to Busan, and privileges that for the nation's economic development. I mean, Park Chung-hee, you can say many terrible things about him, but he did develop industry in South Korea. And I mean, he sent more than 100,000 South Korean men to Vietnam to fight on the side of the U.S. and was paid something like $10,000 per man per year. So he took that money and put it into investment in South Korea's economy. And so this development model left out the southwestern part of the country where Gwangju is, which, I mean, as people felt was a terrible disadvantage because, as I said, under the Japanese, 85% of the people were landless peasants. 50% of the landlords were Japanese. So this area was still poor, undeveloped. And then to top it off, it's a real question, but for centuries, radical Korean intellectuals had been exiled to that region. It was like, let's say, Siberia. There was you couldn't really get rich there. And so you were just sent to the countryside to just get rid of you without killing you. But they all started their own little schools. And the Korean literary tradition was immense. I mean, the U.S. in 1871 attacked North Korea, and it fought actually at least one battle where they won. And the U.S. commander, when he went ashore and looked at where the Koreans were living, one of the first things he wrote is, "I can't believe how many books they have." I mean, the literary tradition in Korea is huge. And again, they have their own language, their own alphabet. So even today, when you go to Korea, if you go into some of the big bookstores, Kyobo Books in Seoul, it's hundreds of people in there pouring through books. It's like nothing I've seen in the United States, like nothing I've seen. So Gwangju was I think it's fair to say, very radical region. And I'm laughing to myself, but so in South Korean culture, as it developed in the Cold War, the people from Chola, Gwangju people, were portrayed as gangsters, were portrayed as thieves, were portrayed as untrustworthy. So there was a cultural prejudice against them. And, so this otherness of the Gwangju area made it easy for the military to pick on it. And the military, so Park Chung-hee is killed by his own CIA chief. As I say, I believe the US put him up to it. He had a huge disagreement with President Carter, and was gonna, some people say, was on his own path to develop nuclear weapons, South Korea's own nuclear weapons. And I think Carter, threatened to pull all US troops out, and then I think they just had him done in. Anyway, he's assassinated, there's a power vacuum, and one of his favorite generals, Chun Du-hwan, seizes power on December 12th, 1979. Protests immediately occur, but Chun is ruthless. He just doesn't care about anything. In the spring, student protest starts. Chun says to the students in Seoul, "Go into the streets tomorrow. I dare you. I'm going to kill you." And so they have a meeting and they say, maybe we should just wait and see. But in Gwangju, the people didn't decide to stay home. They said, "No, we're going back in the streets." So what happens? The United States military commander, who also has operational control at this point of the South Korean military, decides to release the 20th Division. General Wickham releases it for use in Gwangju. The paratroopers are pulled off the front lines with North Korea and told they're going to fight North Koreans in Gwangju. They have no clue. They know this is this strange area, that people are, weird. And they just begin manhandling, raping, bayoneting people. Buses, public city buses are attacked, of people that they go on the bus and they rip off women's clothes and stab them with their bayonets. And taxi drivers are horrified. The cab drivers try to pick up some of these people left in the streets by the army. They're left like beaten, bloody, and, take them to a hospital. The cab drivers are killed by the military. So, it's just the young children are screaming, "The communists have come," because the indoctrination is that the communists do this. So I think it's fair to say people were in shock. Park Nam-son, a friend of mine in Gwangju, who becomes the leader of the citizens' army that forms, told me he was driving his little truck with construction material in it, and somebody came to him and said, "Your brother's in the hospital." And he goes to find his brother, his younger brother, who I also know, and the guy is a mess. He's been stabbed, he's bloody, he's broken bones, and Nam-son just goes out of the hospital and finds people, his buddies, and he has like not 2x4s, but the equivalent of 2x4s in the back of his truck. And they just start fighting back against the soldiers, taking their guns, slowly ambushing. They create ambushes where they'll like run away from soldiers. And then bam, they'll come out of all these, because Gwangju downtown has many small streets and it's like very confusing.
Urban guerrilla warfare.
Yeah. I mean, and they win within a few days. I mean, tremendous sacrifices. I mean, people climbing over dead bodies in the streets to continue the fight. The military opening up with machine guns. The one time a flamethrower was used against people. Grenades were used against people. These people just surging. And it looks like the military is going to win. All of a sudden, more than 100 vehicles formed at the soccer stadium and come right up the main street and go right into the military front lines. And the military has to retreat. They're just like, they don't know what to do. People are setting cars and buses on fire and driving them into the military and jumping out at the last minute. The military is like, who are these people? They're crazy. But people's desire for freedom and being such solidarity. You hurt my brother, I'm going to come at you. You killed my, students, because the students are the cream of the city. They're the ones who are going to help develop the country, develop the region. You treat us like that. And so the people, the taxi drivers who organized the car caravan, the bus drivers, the inner city bus, like Greyhound buses, big buses, they led that procession that turned the tide in favor of people. And then, a few days later, the military opens fire on a crowd in downtown Gwangju, and that's it. People raid police stations, take the weapons, because remember now, every young man in South Korea has had military training.
Yeah.
So they arm themselves and begin fighting back. They win control. The critical thing that happens, and so many people told me this, that they get a 50 caliber machine gun and they mount it on the roof of one of the tallest buildings downtown, the Chonnam National University Hospital, and they control the area that the military is in. The military has to retreat. They don't have a choice. They're under fire, under heavy fire. The military sends a helicopter and the helicopter is shot at. So people win control of the city. And then I should have also mentioned there was the big industry in Gwangju was an automobile factory called Asia Motors. And the fighters in the streets go to the factory and say, why are you people, what are you doing? Can you help us? And the workers give them brand new military grade armored cars and vehicles, 400, more than 400 such vehicles. So now you have a citizens army that's driving around vehicles with their own markings. And of course, alongside of this, people, their own ingenuity, they take metal plates off of streets and weld them to the sides of box vans. And believe it or not, what do they paint on the side of the van? SWAT. They've seen the American TV show. And so they drive the military out of the city and they hold the city. There for 5 days. There's rallies downtown Gwangju at the fountain of tens of thousands of people. The high point, May 23rd, 150,000 people there. And, whole neighborhoods would march in as delegations, factories, workplaces. But, it's fair to say that the whole city, of course, not everybody, but the whole city mobilized in support. I mean, so many people were wounded. The hospitals had no blood. People volunteered for blood. The military was driven out of the center city, but they surrounded the city. They wouldn't let food in. People shared food. Soup kitchens rose up. People just were, being fed. you're out of cigarettes. Shop owners would just give you the cigarettes, one pack at a time. They'd say, wait a minute, buddy, I gotta have some for the next guy. Everybody, there were no reports of crime. The banks were not robbed. The stores, the shoplifters did not go wild, which I suspect in the United States would be one of the first things that would happen if control of a major city was lost. The civil society that emerged was a society of love. I didn't say it at the time, but Koreans said it. Reverend Park Hyung-gyu said this was a community of love. A conservative political scientist years later was sent in by the Political Scientists Association and said, find out what happened, because the military tried to cover this up for more than a decade. And so Chae Jung-woon went in, interviewed people, and he wrote a book. He said this was the absolute community, where someone would die for the person next to them, as though they had known each other their whole lives, when maybe they didn't even know each other. But it was an absolute fusion of people. Sartre's term, the fused group. Anyway, it was an amazing situation, I think. Its energy resonated around the world, certainly in Asia, but let's just start slowly. In the South Chola province, in 17 places, people rallied to support the uprising. The Hwasun coal miners sent dynamite in for the people to use. In Mokpo, the nearby coastal city, 30,000 people rallied, and they took collection and sent more than 1,000 weapons to Gwangju, and had their own small popular uprising where they controlled the city. Even after Gwangju was suppressed on May 27th, May 28th, May 29th, Mokpo remained free. So this whole region rose up, the South Chola region. I mean, I've spoken with people in Busan. They said, we tried to do something, but we didn't have support. And the police were on us. I've spoken with people in Cheonju, in North Chola province, and they said the same thing. We went downtown, we had a rally, but we just didn't have support, and the police were all over us. But in Gwangju, the people not only were courageous and went in the streets, and they won. They won control of the city. They burnt down the TV stations because they were reporting wrongly that this was a mob. And, the U.S. was saying, there's people's tribunals going on. People are being killed. It was the opposite. This was a community of love. It was unbelievable. Even people in Gwangju weren't aware of some of the things I learned, because I took the time. I interviewed for 10 years. I interviewed people, and I often met cab drivers who had been involved, and I would, we would just talk. But I met a Buddhist monk, who had been a very young Buddhist monk, and asked him, where were you during the uprising? He says, it was Buddha's birthday on May 22nd. I said, well, what did you do? He said, well, we talked about it at the monasteries are outside the city usually. And he said, we took the feast we had prepared for Buddha's birthday and we took it downtown because we knew people needed food. And so, everybody pulled together to help this, whatever it was, happen. If you didn't want to pick up a gun, you could be, like I say, carrying the wounded to the hospital. There were all kinds of soup kitchens needed help. A daily newspaper, the Fighters Bulletin, was written and distributed. There's a wonderful wood block. I use them in my book. Hong Sung-dam did, the artist. He started doing these because he did go into the bank manager's offices and find they had these rubber desk pads. And he found that in a city where there wasn't much in the way of art supplies, he used these rubber pads. He carved them out to make these woodblock prints. So they weren't technically wood blocks. They were, but amazing creativity in this period of time. Amazing coming together of people. It didn't matter if you were Christian or Buddhist or what mattered was that the city was under attack, and it was, like I say, direct democracy. Not There weren't representatives. There were a few times representative committees formed, but people booed them at the big rallies, and people would just say no. Or, one professor formed a pretty radical committee and was able to get some dozens of prisoners released because the military had just taken away a lot of people. I think they traded 1,200 weapons for 35 people, the first exchange. But they had plenty of guns. What they didn't have was ammunition. And on May 27th, when it was clear the military was coming, I spoke with many of the fighters, and I learned to ask the question, how many bullets did you have? Some did not have any bullets. So they courageously stood up to fight, to make it appear to the military that they weren't going to be able to just come by. And of course, many people were killed. The ones that they were captured that day had the military, believe it or not, brought magic markers with them and wrote on people's heads, really dangerous, like he had been armed, or, not important, or, so people were, for years, there were trials, and the dead were carried away in garbage trucks to a distant part of the city. But people resisted inside the prisons. They told me we threw chairs at the guards. We sang songs, patriotic songs, but it drove the guards crazy that that people were not just passive. Chun Doo-hwan, a year later, made an unannounced trip to Gwangju, and some women downtown saw him and chased him and his car out of the city. He gave that town, it wasn't a city, gave the town a plaque thanking them for hosting him. They brought it to the place where the dead bodies had been dumped, which is now a national cemetery. And it's a site of pilgrimage for movement people from all over the world. And they embedded that plaque into the walkway where you enter the cemetery, the old cemetery, so people can walk on it and disrespect Chun Doo-hwan in doing so. So at these rallies, three demands were emerged as the core of what people wanted. They wanted those responsible for the massacre to be identified and punished. They wanted compensation for the victims, and they wanted the honor of the city and the people restored. And it took them decades to win that, but they won all of it.
Wow.
Chun Doo-hwan Rotae-woo went to prison. They were sentenced to death, but it was commuted to long prison sentences. And then President Kim Dae-jung, who himself had almost been killed during the Gwangju uprising, he had been arrested, even though he had nothing to do with it, really didn't even know about it. But he pardoned them eventually. And
of course.
But I think, some people, there are ulterior motives for this. He's the one who went to North Korea and met with Kim Jong-il. And the conservatives, there's rabid conservatives in South Korea. I mean, they're crazy. But it's against the law to go to North Korea. And he didn't have like Parliament's approval to, not to be charged under law. They tried to charge him with treason for going to North Korea. So I think he sort of outmaneuvered them by pardoning Chun Doo-hwan Rotae-woo. And, I met Madhav Kumar Nepal, who was leader of Nepal, prime minister of Nepal, who's still active in politics there. He knew of Gwangju before their uprisings. Gregory Honasan, the senator in the Philippines, who was a charismatic military leader, knew of Gwangju. People in Beijing, there a photo book about Gwangju, a large coffee table type book about the uprising. People had taken it apart and plastered it on the wall there in the democracy uprising in 1989, so 9 years later. Kim Dae-jung, as I say, was almost killed. He was the representative of that movement, and the U.S. got him to Harvard. And Benigno Aquino, who was the Philippine senator who was in prison, the U.S. got him out of prison and put him at Harvard. Guess what? He and Kim Dae-jung became partners. When I went to the Philippines, I went to the Aquino Family Museum. They're very wealthy landowners. And all these things of his were on display, including his address book from when he was in the United States. And it happened, because it was under glass, it happened to be open to K. And of course, Ted Kennedy was there. But underneath Ted Kennedy's name was Kim Dae-jung. And so I realized Aquino and Kim knew each other. And then when I was at Harvard, I was speaking with people there. I said, oh, yeah, they had breakfast together. And the cook was Cory Aquino, the wife of Benigno, who became the president of the Philippines after her husband was killed. He went back to the Philippines. He was killed. He never even made it out of the airport. He was killed on the tarmac by Doug Marcos, is the dictator of the Philippines.
Yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, this Gwangju uprising had a huge effect. And then 7 years later in South Korea, over the next 7 years, movement grows against the dictatorship. And part of the movement is tell the truth of what happened in Gwangju. And the U.S. is still in denial. Oh, no, we didn't. I mean, it's just atrocious. The sort of stonewalling the United States has done. But like I say, they released the 20th Division 2 days before the uprising started to go to Gwangju. And it was that division's brutality that really got the whole city to rise up. But the USIS, United States Information Services offices in Korea, are attacked by students with firebombs, sit-ins, and the main USIS office in Seoul is occupied by dozens of students. And their basic demand is, tell us the truth of what happened in Gwangju. We want to know the truth. And the U.S. never admitted to the truth. They released a white paper that was bullshit, basically. And the U.S., during the uprising, this we know, they asked this Chun Doo-hwan not to suppress the uprising until the U.S. had time to bring an aircraft carrier into Busan, which would have enormous air power, right, that could be used against, because they were worried this uprising in South Cholla was spread to the whole country. That's what the U.S. And this is during the time of Iran, when the hostage crisis, right? And Holbrooke says to his team, we don't want another Iran. This is not what we want. And the U.S. Embassy is afraid that the students who were in the streets of Seoul, some of whom climbed over the embassy fence, but guess what? The students were saying, we want asylum. They weren't saying we're going to take it, because South Koreans still have this idea that the U.S. is going to save them.
Right.
So even when word came that the Coral Sea was moving into Busan, many people in Gwangju, including famously their leader, Yoon Sung-won, said, oh, the Americans are coming to save democracy in South Korea. They're not coming.
What democracy at that point? I mean, what?
The hope of democracy.
Right.
That's right.
So I know we're a little over time at this point. Are you comfortable with a couple more questions, or?
Sure. Yes.
Okay. All right. Cool. Well, we appreciate that. So kind of similarly in the same time period, right? In your book, you state, although it seems unlikely the North, meaning North Korea, may have even outpaced the South in economic growth until 1978. At the time, many people maintained that it was superior in people's satisfaction with government and economy as well. Considering this roughly corresponds to the time of the Gwangju uprising, can you describe these political and economic differences in the North and the South during this period?
Sure. I mean, I think if you read almost any mainstream economics books about this, they will validate the fact that North Korea's economic development was superior. We don't, how to say it? So North Korea has tremendous, even under the Japanese, North Korea was an industrial place,
Right.
Northern Korea. Uh, Manchuria as well in China, right? That whole part of Asia has been industrialized for quite some time. And North Korea helped Russia develop its nuclear weapons. The uranium for the first nuclear bombs Russia had came from North Korea.
Mm.
So it had a very advanced, it was built after the Korean War. And it is said only 2 buildings in Pyongyang were left standing after
Right.
the end of the Korean War,
Mhm.
which, being cynical means all the buildings that were built were modern. They were new. And the industry that was built was all modern. It was all new. And Koreans are very in favor of education. So the North built an amazing system. As I said before, the farmers originally were given the land that they farmed. This changed after some time, but the sense of obligation that the government had to its own people was not what the government in Southern Korea had, where there were enormous numbers of poor people, Christian missions, something like the liberation theology in Latin America
Yeah.
arose among Protestant churches and Catholic churches in Southern Korea. The urban industrial mission, there were tremendous slums in South Korea, what were called slums. And these people would just be cleared out of these areas to make room for building. Whereas in Northern Korea, people's housing was built. And it was, as I say, it was all new because the country had been so devastated in the war. I can't quote statistics. I don't have them in my head. But many older Koreans who I spoke with said, oh, for sure. I mean, at the time of the Gwangju uprising, we all thought that Northern Korea was better off. They didn't have the repression that we now think of when we think of North Korea.
Right.
I'm sorry not to be more specific.
No, that was a perfect answer. Thank you. So you're talking about all this entire conversation that we've been having of the nature of the South Korean political system from the end of World War II until relatively recently. You're talking about dictatorship. You're talking about fraudulent elections. Your book documents instances of rampant surveillance, censorship, undercover agents spying on students and workers, and even re-education, or as they're called, purification camps.
Under Chondu-won, yeah.
Yeah.
No,
Do you
terrible.
think many Americans would be surprised to learn that this was happening in South Korea and not North Korea at that time?
Yes, and I think they would be even more surprised to learn that it was the United States funding them, and in some cases even developing the plans for them. I mean, Chun Doo-hwan didn't need any help to be a dictator, but he got a lot of assistance from the United States and his advisors, as did Park Chung-hee. In fact, incoming American presidents have a symbolic first visit by a foreign leader thing. You probably remember now that Trump chose war criminal Benjamin Netanyahu.
Yeah.
First foreign dignitary at the White House in the Trump presidency.
And Ronald Reagan chose Chun Doo-hwan to be his first foreign leader. So the U.S. and immediately, within a day of the massacre and the end of the uprising in Gwangju, Gleistein, the U.S. ambassador, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce were saying, Korea is an incredibly important trading partner. We have to implement policies to build its economy in a way that benefits American corporations. And this is what's called neoliberalism, is introduced in Korea with the full cooperation of Chun Doo-hwan. That's, Reagan and Thatcher's ideas, right? So Chun comes back gung-ho, full head of steam, and says, okay, we're going to take all these people who are not compliant, not conformist, we're going to re-educate them. And so he sets up these camps that are basically, worse than boot camps, where many people die, are injured, are maimed, with U.S. knowledge, approval, and in many cases, funding. His transformation of Korean economy was so well liked by Americans that, foreign investment rose and Korea's foreign debt rose. So the U.S. basically gave a blank check. In fact, on May 22nd, 1980, in the midst of the uprising at the White House, the decision was made to suppress the uprising, but it was also made to send in the head of the U.S. Export-Import Bank to offer South Korea nuclear power and a subway system in Seoul. That, of course, they would borrow the money. In other words, we're going to lend you the money to do this, and it will build your economy. Of course, and it would be American corporations who would do the building. But so it was a whole game that it was like they did this all over the world. 1973 Chile, bloody military coup d'etat, implementation of neoliberal Friedman, the Chicago School economic policies. 76 in Thailand, the bloody massacres at Thammasat University, and so on. Implementation of neoliberal policies. Sri Lanka, Argentina, these are all bloody theaters of taking over the economy and creating neoliberal regimes where American corporations will profit.
I would like, because that you kind of already answered one of my questions that I was going to ask, but just to follow up on what you said, I want to quote your book. You said, a literal sea of blood created South Korea's economic miracle. And furthermore, you said, in a phrase, the United States subordinated the human rights of Korean people and its own professed concern for human rights to the economic interests of American corporations. And I think you've already appropriately answered the question I was going to ask there in response to economics and neoliberalism. But another thing that I think is just important to point out for anybody listening that I think many people wouldn't understand is, like, I think they look at this division of North and South Korea and they look at it as like intractable hatred between the North and the South. But it is true that the Korean reunification has figured prominently in many South Korean uprisings, correct?
Absolutely. And
my camera died, so just don't worry about it.
The songs that people sing at Korean protests are often yearning for Korean unification. Yeah, I mean, the Korean movement has many wings, many focus: ecology, women, unification. These are all streams that are part of that river. Now, if you look at the divisions in the Korean movement, the two main streams are national liberation and people's democracy. National liberation is by far the stronger of the two, and national liberation basically supports North Korea. I don't know anymore today, but there was a poll done roughly 20 years ago, 15 years ago. If the United States and North Korea go to war, for whom will you fight? And as many people said, I'll fight for Korea, as said, I'll fight for the U.S. I'll fight for North Korea, as would fight for the U.S. So commonly popular support for Korea against Japan, against the U.S., against China, against Russia, against everybody, Korea. as the what people's interest in freedom for is about. So it's a misconception, I think, that Koreans are not unified. Like I
Right.
say, even in South Korea, the majority of the movement are. I mean, so for the NL people, just to be clear, the main contradiction is U.S. imperialism. For PD, the popular democracy, people's democracy, the main contradiction is with corporate control.
Right.
And the different emphases, and so. But the point I want to make is that the NL stream, the strongest of the two, in the unions, in all the aspects of the movement's life, basically support North Korea uncritically at some point.
So yeah. So we've taken up a lot of your time here, but just to conclude this interview, I would just like you to just give us this one last piece of one last contribution from you. Considering everything we've discussed about the Korean spirit of resistance, cooperation, people's power, what lessons can American society learn from Korea's modern history?
Well, it's a good question, because just this past few months, the South Korean elected president tried to pull a coup d'etat, right? And what
Yeah.
happened? It was a 5-hour coup d'etat within minutes. People, because when I heard about it, I immediately called friends in Korea, and they were watching TV. I think the whole country was, and so the media and the people who work in the media, everybody rushed into the streets and stopped it. And that means at some point we're going to see, no doubt, uprisings. These were not violent uprisings. They were not, they were, what's the right word? They were disobedient. In other words, the military tried to stop people from going into the parliament building, and the parliamentarians went in. They just forced their way in. Would the U.S. military be so flexible as the military in Korea was? Because these fellows know, the people in the military, they know they're supposed to be in a democracy. It has meaning to them. I'm not sure we have that same consciousness. I mean, some, but Mark Milley was a good example of that. But I just don't know anymore what the culture has produced. I mean, the Trump family is just so atrocious. You probably heard, right, that one of his sons went to Venice and he was killing protected ducks in the ecosystem in Venice.
That's just like cartoonishly evil. Like,
Yeah, it's like Mr. Burns. It's like Mr. Burns level of like evil rich guy
you
behavior.
don't have to do that.
I mean, so I think, in South Korea, people would be shamed. The Bush family's connection to the Nazis is well known, well documented.
And
Connection
if I'm not mistaken, in your book, you bring up a picture of Prescott Bush, Dwight Eisenhower, and one of the convicted class A war criminals from
what's his name?
They were all playing golf together, right?
Right. I mean, and then Abe becomes prime minister of Japan. No shame.
No.
But in South Korea, I'm not sure that would be tolerated in the public, by the civil society. But that's the thing. There is a civil society in Korea. There is. It's, and it has produced these great films that are filmmakers and musicians. And, sure, the media loves to say how it's formed by these industrial consultants who are exploiting these young people, which is true, the capitalist wrapping of it, but the vital energy is coming out of shared history of oppression and desire for freedom. So
it's kind of funny that like the last major, like I think prior to, I forget what the name of like the boy band is now. It's like a K-pop group that all the kids love now. But the last one I remember was that guy Psy. He had that like viral hit.
Right.
All of them have spoken out against American imperialism. It's like literally that without fail, every single one of them at some point, like it comes out on the internet, they're like, oh, they were like telling America to get their tanks out of the Middle East. We don't want that missile systems on our border. Like, go home.
Yes, yes, and then exactly. So yeah, I mean,
and you'll get your freedom.
Thank you so much for spending so much time with us. It has been a delightful conversation, and I appreciate you giving us so much of your time. I would encourage everyone out there, if you're interested in a very human-centered leftist history of philosophy and people's power movements throughout Asia, Europe, and other places, please look into George Katsiaficas' books, and thank you again so much for joining us this week with us.
you're more than welcome, and let me just put in a plug for the website. It's free. There's lots of stuff there. eroseffect.com. Anyway, thanks, guys.
Thank you so much, George. We appreciate it so much.